Hello, everybody. I'm out for appointments today, but um, thought I'd leave a little video lesson with Miss Lowther to go over what was assigned from yesterday. So yesterday we started chapter 12 for those who weren't here. We talked about the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system to start off, and it's called the neuron. You guys remember that. Make sure you don't get it mixed up with the nephron, because nephron was from when we talked about the kidney. So we talked about the nephron very briefly, and then everybody got into groups and they made a nephron, figured out what the parts are and what the jobs of those parts are. And then we got back together and talked about them as a group. Then there were a couple of quick little questions, and we talked about the three main types of neurons. So we had sensory neurons, which carry information from your sensory receptors to the central nervous system, so your brain and spinal cord. We had motor neurons, which are involved in helping you to respond to that sensory information that's taken in. So the motor neurons carry a message from the central nervous system out to what we call effectors. And effectors are basically the different things that will do the job or respond. So they include things like muscles, which is the easiest to remember, because if you think motor, you think probably moving, and to move, we use our muscles. But it can also be glands. So effectors tend to be muscles or glands. The third type were the interneurons. And the interneurons, inter means between, so the interneurons are neurons that go between the other types of neurons. And they're also just found in the central nervous system. So neurons have the same basic parts. They may look different. They may have different sizes, different lengths, but in general, they have the same overall function. So last night for homework, these were the questions. First question deals with the two major parts of the nervous system, so the central and the peripheral nervous system, and says, what are the general roles and components of each? So this is done like a little organizational chart, and I don't expect that you've done this, but some may have. So we start with the human nervous system. It's divided into two subsystems. The CNS, which is the central nervous system, and the PNS, which is the peripheral nervous system. So we look at the central nervous system. It is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, and its job is to interpret information that comes in from the environment and control most activities of the body. So there's a picture down below showing central nervous system. So brain and the spinal cord kind of runs down the center of you. The peripheral nervous system is then subdivided into the somatic and autonomic nervous system. We didn't have to go into a lot of detail for this particular question. We're going to talk about them a little more in a couple of days. What it really means is it's made up of a network of nerves, and those nerves are responsible for connecting the central nervous system with the sensory receptors and the effectors. So they carry information from the receptors to the central nervous system, and from the central nervous system out to the effectors. And this is just a picture showing the peripheral nervous system in blue. So you have, let's see, your brain. I can't draw very well with this. And spinal cord, so there's the central, and then the peripheral are all those nerves shown in blue. The second question is, what are the three main things that protect the CNS? So we've talked in general about the two subsystems. Now we're going to focus a little more on the central nervous system. So what are the three main things that protect it? Well, the first is bone. Okay, so first thing is bone, but you need to kind of go a little bit farther than that. What bone? For the brain, it is protected by the cranium, or it's hard to write with this. Anyway, it's protected by the cranium or the skull. The spinal cord is protected by your vertebrae, or your vertebral column, or spinal column. Not spinal cord that is being protected, okay? It's the vertebrae that are found in your vertebral column or spinal column. Do I expect you to know all the different regions at this level? No. Okay, but sometimes knowing about them can help you understand if the doctor's talking to you about something, or if you're hearing about someone when they had a fracture of their cervical vertebrae, then that can be pretty serious, because that's up at the base of your neck and can lead to paralysis if it's enough damage. Okay, so you might hear people saying a lumbar puncture. Well, that means that they're going in between the vertebrae in the lumbar region, your lower back region. Okay, so I don't expect you to know those region terms, but sometimes it's nice to understand them if people are talking about them. Second is what we call the meninges. And the meninges are a set of really tough membranes. The next question was asking you to list those from the outermost layer to the innermost layer. The dura mater is the outermost. It lies just underneath the skull. The arachnoid is the second, or the middle layer. Okay, and if you look, the arachnoid has a whole bunch of, almost looks like webbing in here. So think of a spider, arachnoid. That's the name for that layer. The pia mater lies right against the brain tissue, or the spinal cord tissue. So it's the innermost layer. You've probably heard of a kind of infection or inflammation that happens to these membranes, or in around these membranes. Okay, so if we know that infection or inflammation often ends in itis, and it's around the areas surrounding the central nervous system, within these membranes, we call it meningitis. And in order to check and see if you have meningitis, they'll often try and draw out some of the fluid that's in around there. So the third thing that helps to protect is that fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid, okay, CSF. The cerebrospinal fluid is a special fluid that fills the space between the inner and middle membranes. So between the pia mater and the arachnoid, where all that spongy looking or web looking membrane was, it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Within the brain, it also fills these spaces called the ventricles, and certain of the ventricles are actually where it's produced. So this is the lateral ventricle, and it is produced within there, and probably within some of the others, but um, within the lateral ventricle is something called the choroid plexus, and it helps in production of the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid is kind of like it's like a shock absorber, so that if you have a blow to the head or a blow to your spinal column, it kind of helps to absorb that blow, so it's not able to cause as much damage to the brain. So there'd be cerebrospinal fluid out around here between the brain tissue and the skull. There's also cerebrospinal fluid within the spaces that are inside, and more down around the spinal cord. Okay, so there was there was bone, and there was the meninges, and then there was the cerebrospinal fluid. But you should know a little bit more detail in the type of bone for each, and then the names of the meninges. The next question says, why can brain surgery be performed without an anesthetic, with the patient being awake? So usually they would give a local or topical anesthetic so that you don't feel when they cut through your skin. Okay, but then you'll hear them sawing through the bone of the skull. But I'm sure you've read, that the brain itself does not have any pain receptors. So to perform surgery in there, it's not going to make you feel pain at the time, and it's important that they're able to talk to you so they can tell if they're touching on anything that could be causing some damage, or so that they can pinpoint certain regions and what might be causing certain things to happen in you. So if you can imagine, a lot of what we know about the brain has come from early studies of the brain that were like this, where they would do a surgery and some would just touch different areas within the brain and kind of see what kind of response those would give. And they were able to find out that certain regions, if they touched, would bring about certain memories, or different things would happen with them, or maybe it would cause them to slur their speech, or some sort of thing that would indicate to them a function of that part of the brain. So it's difficult for them to study how the brain works, because usually to study people's brains, um, unless they're doing surgery on the brain, then they have to work with a brain of dead people. And that's pretty hard to do. And like, you can do tissue studies, but it's difficult to figure out their functions that way. Now, with the technologies we have, we're going to learn about some of the really cool machines that they can use and visualize things lighting up within your brain when you do certain things, so they can tell, because of the technology advances, some degree of the function. So, pretty cool. Okay, so white, gray, what does it matter? We kind of started talking a bit about this yesterday. Um, Gray matter is basically neural tissue comprised of nerve cells that lack the myelin sheath. And if they don't have the myelin sheath, then they definitely don't have neurolemma. And yesterday we talked a bit about the neurolemma and how important it is, because it allows regeneration or healing whenever there might be a certain amount of damage to the axons or sections of the neurons. Okay, so if it's gray matter, it definitely doesn't have neurolemma, and it cannot be regenerated after an injury. So usually damage to the gray matter is permanent. White matter, on the other hand, so if you look at these pictures over here, this top one is a top-down view of the brain, and you can see that the white is more in the center of the brain. So here's all this stuff is white matter, okay? But around the outside, the very thin outside, which is, remember we talked about naming regions, the outer region would be the cortex, okay? So the outer region is the gray matter within your brain. There's some other spots too, but it's mostly right around the edge. The white matter shows white because of the myelin. Okay, so if there's a myelin sheath, then there would be white matter showing up because myelin, we said, is made up of protein and fatty stuff. Fat appears white. So the white matter has myelin around it. Now, the myelin that's made within the central nervous system is made by different cells than within the peripheral nervous system. So within your brain and spinal cord, they're made by what are called oligodendrites. And the oligodendrites do not have neurolemma. The neurolemma is that outer region around the Schwann cell that's wrapped around the axon. Okay, so because there's neurolemma in the PMS, okay, there's neurolemma in the PNS, sorry, then those regions have the ability, depending on the level of damage, they have the ability to regenerate if there's damage. So oftentimes if you have an injury to the nerves that are going to or from your central nervous system, then they might be able to heal themselves. It can take a while, but they might be able to heal themselves. Over here, if you look, the bottom diagram is showing the spinal cord. I forgot to highlight it. But see this part in the center of it? Kind of looks like a butterfly. This is the gray matter. Okay, whereas the outer part, the larger part around, this is white matter. Okay, so the difference between the white matter and the gray matter is the presence of myelin, and if it's in the PNS, then it's got the neurolemma around it, which allows for a certain degree of regeneration if there's damage. What happens in the CNS, sometimes if a part of the brain, for instance, is damaged, it may not be able to be regenerated, but another part of the brain may try to help and kind of compensate for the part that's not working as well. Sometimes. It depends on where and what kind of damage it is. So today we're going to take a little closer look at the CNS. So the parts, we're going to start with the brain. We're going to look at the different regions and parts of the brain and what they do. The brain is divided into three main regions. We have the forebrain, which includes the cerebrum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. We have the midbrain, okay, which according to the name it suggests it's kind of in the middle. And then we have the hindbrain towards the back of your head. That includes the cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata. Okay, so in this diagram, the part that's highlighted in red is the forebrain. The part that's highlighted in green, pretty small, just one part, is called the midbrain. And then the part highlighted in blue, or circled in blue, is the hindbrain. And just to the right of that is an actual sheep brain. So they look fairly similar, these brains. And really, the brain is much more complex than the diagrams that we're going to be using, if you were to look at it in 3 dimension and look at the different parts and what's in different sections and what all you find in the center, then we would get into even more terms and more names of systems and things like that. But we're just focusing on the main things that you see in a cross section, okay, and what we see around the outside. Okay, one question that I'd like you to find out, and some of you may know already, is what 3 parts do you find in the brainstem? Because I'm sure you've heard people or seen on shows where they say, oh, there's damage to the brainstem, or they had a stroke and it's affected the brainstem, or um, things like that. So the brainstem is critical for life functions. If there's damage to the brainstem, within the brainstem is a part that looks after your heart rate, your heart beating, your breathing, all those things that are keeping you alive. So if there's damage to that region, then it may be a very um, quick situation where you die before you even get to the hospital, or it may be that they have to put you on life support until, if it's just swelling or something like that, then maybe you wait till the swelling goes down and things might come around. But oftentimes, if there's damage to that region, it can be a really bad sign for the person. Okay, they may not be able to pull through. So I'd like you to find out what are those 3 parts that you find in the brainstem. Now, you have a choice today. You can work in groups if you want to help each other out, or you can work by yourself. Ms. Lowther is going to hand out brain diagrams, and I want you to look in your book, and you might find things helpful around the room, but I'd like you to label the brain diagram. So there's words there for you, and you just need to put them in the right spots. Okay, read about the parts and their functions. I think it's right around page 399 to 401, somewhere in there. Okay, maybe I'll write that down so you don't forget. Oh, maybe I'll try. That's 399 to 401 in there. Okay, and so I'd like you to label your diagram, and then if you have room on your diagram, you can jot down some of their functions, or you can put the functions in your scribbler or in your binder. Okay, so we're going to start with this one. Okay, with this side, it's a cross section of the brain. And then when you finish that, I want you to turn it over and learn about, there's a diagram on the back that's showing the different lobes or 4 different sections of the outer part of the cerebrum. Okay, the cerebrum is the part of your brain that makes you so special compared to other animals. Okay, it gives us our intelligence, and it gives us our personality, and gives us qualities that other animals just don't possess. So the cerebrum, if we look at it, the outer region of it is divided into lobes that they talk about it that have different functions. So the back side of the sheet, you're going to label the lobes and what each lobe is kind of responsible for in terms of their functions. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video now, and I'm not sure if you'll have time for much more today. So if you don't get to look at this and correct it today, we'll definitely be looking at it together tomorrow, and I'd like to see that you have them all done. You might want to leave a little bit of room in case you want to add some things when we're talking about it tomorrow. But hope you have a good rest of your day.